Terrorists attack the heart of America. Hijacked planes smash into New York's tallest buildings. The World Trade Center collapses with thousands of people trapped inside. Another airliner then flew into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the American military.
Today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people. Acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country.
President Bush said those responsible would be hunted down. He's due to address the nation within the next hour.
This is BBC News. I'm Deborah Mackenzie.
And I'm Bill Turnbull. Thousands of people are feared dead after a devastating series of terrorist attacks on the United States of America. At about 9 a.m. local time, hijacked passenger aircraft were flown deliberately into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Within the next 2 hours, the center of Manhattan's business area lay in ruins after the twin towers of the Trade Center, America's two tallest buildings, collapsed. All air traffic in the country was suspended and security forces were put onto a state of the highest alert. President Bush, who'd been visiting Florida, was evacuated to a nuclear bunker from where he pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible. He's now in the White House, preparing to address the nation within the hour. The first blow was struck at 8:45 in the morning, New York time. A hijacked airliner carrying dozens of passengers flew straight into the World Trade Center's North Tower with devastating effect. 18 minutes later, a second attack. Another hijacked jet struck the Trade Center's twin South Tower, exploding in a huge fireball. Next, it was the turn of Washington and the Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military. A third hijacked American airliner, again with dozens of passengers on board, deliberately flown into the side of the building. As panic spread on the streets, all civilian flights were grounded. New York's stock exchange was suspended and the White House was evacuated, along with thousands of personnel in other government buildings. Then the unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, the world's fourth tallest building, collapsed. Followed minutes later by the center's second tower, the building symbol of global trade and workplace for 50,000 people, reduced to rubble. No one knows how many have died. A fourth hijacked plane crashed later in Pennsylvania. Well, we can get the latest now from Washington and our correspondent Tom Carver. Tom, presumably America still trying to establish the extent of the devastation.
Exactly. I have to say tonight the capital of the world superpower here, Washington, D.C., feels very much like a city under siege. The only aircraft that has been in the skies here for the last 8 hours has been Air Force One, bringing the president back to a White House and an astonished Capitol here behind me. Congress has been evacuated, many congressmen taken out to safe areas. The federal buildings, the FBI, and of course the Pentagon have all been evacuated. Smoke is still coming out of the Pentagon from where one of the airliners crashed into the first floor of that building. Out on the streets here in Washington, we have spotted armored cars belonging to the National Guard. And likewise, in many cities across America, the National Guard has been deployed as security measures. The phone lines have been jammed for much of the day. The motorways up and down the East Coast here have also been jammed. Obviously, this is a country that is trying to come to terms with astonishing events, an attack really quite unparalleled in its history. There have been talks about a similarity to Pearl Harbor, but this is really different because there is no obvious enemy here. They are invisible, apparent terrorists who are prepared to take their own lives for the sake of their cause. We've been having some greater detail of information coming out about what happened. We understand that the plane from Boston to Los Angeles, which crashed into the World Trade Center, John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, told us that the crew were overwhelmed by a group of hijackers carrying knives. That appears to have also happened on the United plane that went also from Boston to Los Angeles, which also crashed into the World Trade Center a few moments later. The plane that took off from Dulles outside Washington here was the one again heading for for the West Coast. All these planes were destined for the West Coast, the theory being that they had a full tank and a large amount of fuel to maximize the fireball that they then caused. The plane from Dulles crashed into the Pentagon, again the assumption being that they were overwhelmed by hijackers with knives. And then a fourth plane which took off from Newark outside New York, heading for San Francisco, was apparently on its way down to Washington as well when it appeared to have crashed into a field in Pennsylvania en route. The speculation here being tonight that somehow the hijackers were overwhelmed and that a fight must have ensued inside the cabin of that plane. But as I say, it is all speculation. And as you can imagine, George Bush in the White House behind me is preparing furiously for what is going to be the most important address of his life in 25 minutes' time to a nation. Somehow he's going to have to rally the American nation together, because it's in times like these of deep crisis that America really does look to its president for help. Let's now go back over the world, over the day's astonishing events. Here is James Robbins.
It should have been a perfect day, but just before 9 o'clock, the pure blue sky over Manhattan was filling with smoke. A hijacked American airliner had just smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. No one quite knew what had happened. Surely this must have been a terrible accident. But what happened next showed these were no accidents. A second hijacked airliner, a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board, is flying straight for the other tower. No one yet knows who piloted these planes to destruction, but they could not have been targeted with greater accuracy. The extraordinary impact of the second plane, the 767, was witnessed by many who simply didn't realize the full enormity of what was happening. Nor could they know the implications of a huge airliner laden with aviation fuel exploding deep inside one of the world's tallest buildings. They certainly didn't realize the twin towers of the World Trade Center were now completely doomed.
Wow, do you see this aircraft? I've got it all.
By now, many hundreds of people must already have been dead, and the unfolding disaster could be seen all around New York.
Another one. Taking a look.
Oh my God! Oh, Jesus! Oh my God! My own eye. It just went. It must be perfect. Oh my God! Another plane just went in.
At that time, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center, many thousands more in the Wall Street financial district all around. Those who could were running for their lives.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
But it wasn't only New York and America's financial heart which was under attack. Now it was the nation's capital, too. In Washington, the Pentagon was hit, headquarters for the armed forces of the world's superpower. A third hijacked airliner, again with dozens on board, had been crashed with devastating results. By now, smoke was billowing around Capitol Hill, and the White House was being evacuated. People were talking of a new Pearl Harbor, someone declaring war on the United States. And back in New York, the nightmare was still far from over. Firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above was safe. The unthinkable was about to happen. The South Tower, all 110 stories, collapsed, and it was all live on American television.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
Do not go down the ground. You will get trapped. You will get trapped. Don't go.
Big boom. Come down the steps. Everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy. Crawled out. Kept getting hit in the head. Bags rolled around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
In a moment, we'll be going back to Washington to speak to Jonathan Clark, Research Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Research Institute. Mr. Clark's an expert on American foreign policy. But first, in the studio with me here is Anjem Choudary, who's leader of the British political party Al-Muhajirun, which attracts young British Muslims with its brand of radical ideas. He says the Pentagon would have been a legitimate target because of the America's policy on the Middle East. Thank you for coming into the studio. There's no indication yet, no firm indication as to who's responsible and no firm claim for responsibility, but the speculation is that it's based in the Middle East. Someone somewhere is justifying this. How could they do that?
Let us make the point, first of all, that we regret the loss of any innocent lives, whether we be Muslims or Christians. This is something which is unacceptable. Those people who are not involved in war, who are not perpetrating any violence anywhere in the world, they do not deserve to be targeted. However, we can get an indication of the feeling of the Muslims worldwide by the fact that if you go to Baghdad or you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find that people are celebrating in the streets. That will indicate to you that there is a feeling of retribution or revenge against American atrocities being committed at the present time in the Middle East.
American atrocities?
American atrocities being committed. For example, their continued support of the tyrant state of Israel, the continuing bombing of Iraq, the unilateral bombing indeed a few years ago of Sudan and Afghanistan. We have a long list of atrocities which America have committed, which are enough for the Muslims and the Islamic movements worldwide to consider that they are in fact in a state of war with the American government.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, it seems this has come about because it's payback time for America's foreign policy.
Yes, that may be the case, but I think one of the things that does stand out today has been the number of messages flowing in from the Arab world, from all over the Arab world, and from Mr. Arafat himself, deploring this incident, condemning this as an outrage, and really dismissing any participation in this by the Palestinians. So I think that's an encouraging sign.
Anjem Choudary with us here in the studio. This is just a surely solitary act by a group of extremely radical fanatics who have no real base of support anywhere in the world.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think that the
well,
regimes...
you just said, but hang on a second, Mr. Jonathan Clark just said, pointed to the number of messages of condolence that have come in from Middle Eastern nations.
But the Middle Eastern nations are run by tyrant regimes, and they have dictators who have nothing at all to say about Islam, and they don't base their policies upon the divine text. Those people who represent the views of the Muslims and Islam worldwide are those legitimate scholars, and fatwa have been issued, for example, by the Sharia courts of the UK today, that American military personnel and buildings and war machinery remains and has been, up until today, a legitimate target because of atrocities which they have been committing.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, do you think this appalling attack is going in any way to change America's policy towards the Middle East?
Well, I think what is going on right now is a period of rational and calm reassessment. The United States policy in the Middle East has been very consistent for over a large number of administrations. I very much doubt that it's going to change in the face of this outrage. But clearly what you are going to be seeing is inside the American government a reconsideration of American foreign policy around the world. But I don't think you're going to see dramatic changes, especially not in the face of this type of provocation.
Anjem Choudary, it's not going to change anything. Thousands of people will have died for nothing.
I think that whoever was behind the actions which took place today are not really the focus point for us. I think what we need to do is we need to look to why people are targeting American interests. Why have people taken the stance that we need to attack the Pentagon, we need to attack the political and the economic and the strategic locations, and really inflict damage upon the American government. And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes, and I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship, a relationship based on debate and discussion.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, is America going to learn the sort of lesson that Mr. Choudary wants it to?
I think he's rather exaggerating the present relations between the United States and the Arab world. Generally speaking, these are very good. If you think about relations with countries like the Gulf Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait, I think with Egypt, you see a very great sign of friendship and solidarity with those nations. There are obviously major disagreements over Israel, but I think that overall the relationships with the Arab world are good, and they're not going to change as a result of this. So I wouldn't take this out of perspective in terms of American foreign policy. I really wouldn't. I think that this is going to continue in the way that American foreign policy towards the Middle East has been set for a great number of administrations.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, Anjem Choudary here in London. Thank you both very much. Deborah.
This is BBC News now, a summary of the main news. America and the rest of the world is in shock tonight after New York and Washington were hit by a series of major terrorist attacks. Several thousand people are thought to have lost their lives when two hijacked passenger planes flew directly into the side of the twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center during the early morning rush hour. Both towers caught fire immediately and later collapsed, sending clouds of dust and billowing smoke into Manhattan as people frantically tried to escape.
And we held on to each other, and he flashed a light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Shortly after the first two strikes, another hijacked Boeing 757 crash-landed near the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its five-sided structure collapsed. A fourth airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after apparently being hijacked. President Bush has consulted his national security advisors and visited two air bases.
The full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
And President Bush is to make another national address shortly. The number of casualties may not be known for at least 24 hours, but the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, says the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. Rescue workers are being hindered by a thick fog of ash, fumes and debris from the ruins. Some 260 people on board the planes are assumed dead. The American Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, said the Pentagon was functioning and would be open on Wednesday. He said the United States was in no way connected to explosions that have been occurring in the Afghan capital, Kabul, this evening. American forces around the world have been placed on the highest alert, and warships have been deployed along the US East Coast. There's been widespread condemnation of the attacks. The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said it was a war between terrorists and the free world.
Well, in New York, the rescue effort is really just getting underway after the collapse of not just the World Trade Center's twin towers, but also the 47-story Solomon building next door to it. For the latest, we can go now to New York and join our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, bring us up to date, if you can, on what's happening now.
Well, we still have no further concrete word on casualty figures, as you said, though people are expecting very horrific numbers. But just down behind me, where the World Trade Center towers used to be, we can still see a thick plume of smoke and of ash in the air, and queues of rescue vehicles, heavy lifting gear being brought in, reinforcements of police in buses and cars, ambulances, all the emergency services getting in. And we know that the mayor of the city, Rudolph Giuliani, and the governor of New York have been appealing for any medical staff in the area to come here to help out, because we've already seen several thousand people being treated in a tent hospital out in New York Bay, and we know that some of those are New York City police officers. We think about 100, and we have unconfirmed as yet reports that as many as 200 firefighters may have been killed and 70 police officers are missing. They were emergency personnel around the building when the towers fell down. So New York in a state of panic and of great grief.
After the collapse of the Solomon building, Jane, are the other buildings in that area stable? Hello, Jane?
Nada.
No, I think we've lost Jane Stanley in New York. We'll try and get back to her later. Deborah.
And now a summary of the main news on BBC News. The United States of America has been hit by a wave of terrorist attacks, the worst the world has seen. Two hijacked planes crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center in New York early on Tuesday morning, causing both buildings to collapse. A third plane then struck the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., the heart of American military intelligence. A fourth plane, also believed to be hijacked, crashed in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Thousands of people are feared dead. All air traffic into and out of America has been suspended and borders with Canada and Mexico closed. President Bush has vowed to hunt down and punish those responsible. Quick look at today's events. They've been described as America's second Pearl Harbor. Such was the belief and this horror. This is BBC News.
Well, how could it happen? That's one of the questions being asked not just in the United States but around the world. 4 aeroplanes hijacked in a single day and then used for unimaginable purposes, really. With us in the studio is Dr. Martin Navius, who's a defense and security analyst. Dr. Navius, thank you for joining us. How does it happen?
Well, this is a terrorist attack that has been long in the making. There's no doubt that the sophisticated organization that was behind this has planned this for years. The logistics involved were enormous. The sophistication of the organization and its terrorist professionalism is obviously great, and this has been planned for a long time. The results are terrible, and we can only guess at the political and military consequences.
It was reported, if I recall correctly, some time ago that this was an ambition of certain terrorist groups to hijack airplanes in the United States and crash them into major buildings. So why were the authorities, why were the intelligence networks so caught by surprise?
Well, no doubt there will be an investigation into this, and it's impossible to know why they were kept out of the loop here, if they were. Threats of this kind are made known to security agencies all the time. You get various indications of potential terrorist attacks, and it's very difficult sometimes to know which ones are the real ones and which ones are just noise, or just attempts by the terrorist organization to increase insecurity and increase misperceptions, so that when the real attack comes, you're caught unawares. There will be a lengthy investigation during which heads no doubt will roll, and we will be able to find out. The problem is it is very difficult to prevent all terrorist attacks.
American airport security also notoriously lax.
Domestic security is notoriously lax, and no doubt this will be changed, but obviously too late for this event. American policy vis-à-vis terrorism in the Middle East and elsewhere will have to change, and this, I think, will be the focus of efforts of the Bush administration.
Little details that are seeped out from people who managed to make phone calls from these planes before they crashed were that the hijackers appear to be armed simply with knives.
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't need massive amounts of explosives to take over an aircraft. Anyone who has used a domestic flight in the United States knows that the security is often rudimentary, a simple electronic device to check goods going into the aircraft, into the cabin. And obviously the quality of the staff and the quality of the equipment is not always 100%. The terrorists planned these operations. No doubt they've done dry runs in Boston and elsewhere over a number of months, and they worked out that they could move their equipment through relatively easily.
Dr. Martin Navius, thank you very much. Well, the events of the past 12 hours have been described as America's second Pearl Harbor. Such was the disbelief and horror at the terrorist attacks. We can take a look back now at some of the images and reactions from eyewitnesses.
Let's just get back. Get back.
What is it? They just think there's going to be another explosion.
Try to save people. In the moment we heard a big explosion coming down. Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them. And it was a big explosion. Everything got dark, real dark, like snow. You can see behind me, oh, this is not snow. This is all from the building. It was a terrible nightmare.
Big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping.